The summer of 1877 pressed down on Black Oak Bend like the flat of God's hand after a beating. Heat rose off the red clay in shimmering ghosts, and even the cicadas sounded drunk, rasping themselves raw in the loblolly pines. Down by the slough where the colored folks had their cabins, the air smelled of sweat and wood smoke and the sweet rot of muscadines gone too long on the vine. Silas Blue was 12 years old and already beautiful the way a straight razor is beautiful. Something sharp and dangerous wrapped in something you couldn't stop staring at. His skin was the deep polished mahogany of his mama's people, but his eyes, Lord, those eyes were the color of creek water in January, pale and cold and lit from the inside by something that had no business living in a colored child's face. Folks said Delphine must have laid down with a white man who carried ice in his blood. Folks said a lot of things, most of them loud enough for Silas to hear while he walked the rows picking cotton, sack dragging behind him like a dead thing. He moved through the fields barefoot, quick as a water moccasin, humming low under his breath, some old song his grandmama brought up from the Gullah coast before the war. The other children kept a circle of space around him, the way you keep space around a lit fuse. They loved him fierce and feared him fiercer. When he laughed, it rang out bright and sudden like a cracked bell, and every head turned whether they wanted it to or not. Old man Jebediah Pike, the overseer who still wore his gray coat like the Confederacy might rise again if he just kept it brushed, watched Silas the way a man watches storm clouds gathering over his crop. Pike's eyes were pale, too, but the washed-out gray of dirty dishwater, nothing like the living winter in the boy's face. One afternoon he caught Silas resting in the shade of a chinaberry tree when he should have been chopping. Pike took his quirt and laid 3 stripes across the boy's shoulders, hard enough to raise welts like purple lightning. Silas never cried out, just turned those impossible eyes on the white man and smiled, small, polite, terrible. Pike stumbled backward like he'd been slapped by something colder than hands. After that, he found reasons to ride the far fields when Silas was working. At night, the boy slept on a pallet beside his mother's bed, one thin arm flung out as if reaching for something just beyond the veil. Delphine would wake sometimes and watch the moonlight slide across his face, watch the faint blue glow that seemed to come from under his skin like foxfire under bark. She told herself it was only the moon playing tricks. She told herself a lot of things. In the quarters, they called him Star Child behind his back, half in awe, half in warning. Aunt Violet, the root woman who lived in a cabin ringed with bottles full of graveyard dirt and rainwater, said the boy was born with the caul still clinging to his face like wet silk, and that meant the door between here and over there never shut proper behind him. She gave Delphine a little bag of asafoetida and graveyard dirt to hang over the door. Delphine hung it. She also kept a sharp knife under her pillow and a Bible open to Psalms on the table. Some nights she used one, some nights the other. Most nights she used both. Silas himself never seemed to notice how the world bent around him. He chased lightning bugs until the jar he carried glowed like a lantern made of green stars. He dove into the slough and came up laughing with a catfish bigger than his own leg. He could find water in the driest season by pressing his ear to the ground and listening for something only he could hear. And when he sang, Jesus helped the person who heard Silas Blue sing. Every voice in the quarters fell silent, and even the dogs stopped barking to listen. But by the middle of July, the fever rolled in off the river like judgment. It took the weakest first, old folks, babies, the ones already half gone from hunger or sorrow. Then it started taking the strong.
Silas went down on a Tuesday when the sun stood straight overhead and the air itself seemed to burn the lungs.
He was in the field when it hit him, halfway down a row of cotton that looked like snow somebody had set on fire. One moment he was singing soft to himself, voice threading through the heat like cool water, and the next his legs folded under him as gently as a prayer cloth slipping from a woman's hands. The sack fell from his shoulder, and the bowls scattered across the dirt like white hail. Big Ruth, who was picking 2 rows over, saw him go down and let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a prayer. She dropped her own sack and ran, heavy feet pounding the middles, shouting his name the way you shouted a dream you're trying to wake from. By the time she reached him, his eyes had already gone glassy, that impossible blue filmed over with something milky and far away. They carried him home on a door somebody pried off its hinges. Delphine met them at the edge of the yard, apron twisted in her fists so hard her knuckles looked carved from hickory. She didn't cry then, not yet. She just took her boy in her arms like he weighed nothing and walked the rest of the way herself, barefoot over the sharp gravel, leaving little red prints that steamed in the heat. Inside the cabin, they laid him on the bed he'd slept in since he was born. The room was already thick with the smell of sickness, sweet and metallic, like copper pennies left in the rain. Delphine sent the children running for cool well water, for willow bark, for anything that might bargain with death. Aunt Violette came with her black bag and her blacker face, muttering over Silas in a tongue older than any church in Alabama. She burned feathers under his nose and poured something dark and bitter between his lips, but the boy never flinched. His breathing had gone shallow and quick, the way a rabbit breathes when the hawk's shadow passes over. Night came down hard. The kerosene lamp painted everything the color of old blood. Outside, the quarters were unnaturally quiet. Even the crickets seemed to be holding their breath. Delphine sat beside the bed with Silas's head in her lap, rocking though he was far too big for it now. Every time his chest rose, she thanked God. Every time it fell, she begged him not to take the next one. At some point, the blue glow started. Not from the lamp, not from the moon spilling through the chinks in the wall, but from under the skin itself. Faint at first, just a suggestion along the cheekbones and the thin bridge of his nose. Then stronger. Strong enough that Ruth, keeping vigil in the corner, crossed herself, though she'd never been Catholic a day in her life. Strong enough that Aunt Violette stepped back from the bed and made a sign with her fingers that looked like she was locking something away. Delphine saw it too, and for one terrible second her heart leapt with something that felt almost like hope. Then Silas opened his eyes wide, sightless and shining like twin winter stars, and the hope curdled into something colder. His lips moved. No sound came out, but Delphine heard it anyway, clear as if he'd shouted it inside her skull. "Mama, it's dark where I am. Mama, don't let them close the door." Then the light went out all at once, like someone snuffing a candle between wet fingers. His chest did not rise again. The silence that followed was so complete, Delphine heard the exact moment her own heart broke. It sounded like ice cracking on the river in February. She held him until morning, until the body in her arms was colder than any living thing had a right to be. She held him until the neighbors came with the pine box and the quilt his grandmama had pieced from flour sacks and sorrow. She held him until they pried him gently from her fingers and told her it was time. Only then did Delphine Blue begin to scream. And somewhere far beneath the willow that would soon mark his grave, something small and newly dead opened its eyes in the dark and began to listen for her voice. Chapter 1, complete, 908 words. The cabin still smelled of lye soap and death when the sun came up the next morning, pale and merciless.
Delphine stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to keep her insides from spilling out. The pine box waited in the yard, lid propped open like a hungry mouth. They would bury Silas Blue before the heat could do worse to him than it already had. But something in the air had already begun to turn. They washed him at dawn, because the dead must be clean before they meet the Lord, and Delphine would not let any hand but hers touch her child. The water in the tin basin turned the color of weak coffee the first time she dipped the rag, then rust, then something darker she refused to name. She worked slow, the way you work when time has already stopped meaning anything. Each stroke across his chest was a prayer she no longer believed in. Each circle over the small brown knees that used to pedal the air when he laughed too hard was an apology she would never finish speaking. Big Ruth and Sister Morrow stood by, ready to help, but Delphine waved him off with a look that could have frozen the river. This was between her and the boy who used to live in this skin. Nobody else was invited. She dressed him in the white shirt she had sewn for Easter 2 years ago, the one he'd outgrown in the shoulders but refused to give up because the collar still smelled like Sunday. The sleeves hung past his fingertips now, the way they do when a child stops growing in the only way that matters. She buttoned it all the way to the throat, hiding the faint bruises blooming beneath the skin like spilled ink under rice paper. When she came to the last button, her fingers shook so badly she had to start over 3 times. Aunt Violette waited outside with the cedar shavings and the penny for his mouth. She had already sprinkled salt along the threshold and nailed a horseshoe above the door, points up to catch whatever might try to ride back in on the wind. She watched Delphine through the open doorway and said nothing. Some grief is too loud for words. Some grief is so quiet it swallows the room. Inside, the only sound was the soft slap of the rag in the basin and Delphine's breathing, shallow and careful, as if too deep a breath might wake him. She combed his hair with her fingers the way she had every night since he was born, parting it on the left because that was how he liked it. The curls were still soft, still held the faint scent of the coconut oil she rubbed into his scalp every Saturday night while he read the Bible aloud to her by lamplight, stumbling over the long words and laughing when she corrected him. She leaned close to his ear and whispered the secret name she had given him the day he was born, the one no living soul but her had ever heard. She whispered it like a key turning in a lock she already knew was broken. When she kissed his forehead, the skin was cold enough to burn. Outside, the men lifted the pine box onto the mule cart. The wood was green and wept sap that looked like tears in the early light. Someone had lined it with the quilt his grandmama made, the one with the wedding ring pattern in indigo and blood red. Delphine watched them settle him inside and felt something tear loose in her chest, something that would never be sewn back together. She climbed up beside the box herself. No one tried to stop her. The mule started forward with a jerk, and the cartwheels sang their creaking song all the way to the graveyard under the willow. Halfway there, Delphine reached into the box and took her son's hand. It was already stiff, the fingers curled like a small brown bird that had forgotten how to fly. She held it anyway, lacing her fingers through his the way she did when they crossed the river bridge and he was afraid of the spaces between the planks. She began to sing, low and steady, the song she used to sing when thunderstorms scared him under the bed. By and by, don't you cry, Mama gon' keep you dry. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she kept singing until the willow came into view, its branches sweeping the ground like a mourner's veil. And beneath the quilt, unknown to a living soul, Silas Blue's fingers twitched once against her mother's palm, as gentle as a moth testing the air before flight.
The grave had been dug the night before by men who worked fast and spoke little, because nobody wanted to be caught out there after moonrise with a hole waiting for a child. The red clay was piled high on one side like fresh liver, wet and shining. When the cart stopped, the mule dropped its head and blew hard through its nostrils, as if it smelled something the humans had not yet caught. Delphine climbed down first. She did not let them lift the box. She took one end herself, and Big Ruth took the other without being asked. Together they carried Silas the last 30 yards, their feet sinking ankle-deep in the soft earth. The preacher waited by the hole, Bible already open to Corinthians, sweat running down his temples and staining his collar black. He kept glancing at the boy's face as if expecting him to sit up and ask what all the fuss was about. They lowered the box with 2 ropes that had buried half the quarters in the last 20 years. The ropes creaked like old bones. When the pine box settled at the bottom, the sound it made was soft, almost polite, the way a door closes when you're trying not to wake someone. Delphine stepped forward. She had carried something in her apron pocket the whole way, a small blue jay feather Silas found the day he learned to whistle like a bird. She laid it on the quilt right over his heart. Then she took the dirt in her bare hands and let it fall. It hit the wood with a hollow drumming that sounded too much like rain on a roof where no one lived anymore. One by one the others followed, each tossing in a handful. Some whispered scripture, some whispered nothing at all. When Aunt Violet stepped up, she opened her fist and let fall not dirt, but a thin line of gray ash mixed with something that glinted like powdered glass. She did not look at the preacher when she did it. The preacher pretended not to see. They filled the grave faster than anyone wanted to admit. The mound rose quick and ugly, a fresh wound in the earth. Someone set the wooden marker Jebediah Pike had burned the name into with a hot poker. Silas Blue, 1865-1877. The numbers looked wrong, too close together, like a lie someone forgot to finish telling. Afterward, the people drifted away in 2s and 3s, heads down, the women clutching their aprons like they might fly apart if they let go. Delphine stayed. She stood there until the sun climbed high enough to burn the mist off the river, until the sweat soaked through her dress and her feet went numb in the hot dirt. Only when the shadows of the willow branches lay across the grave like long, dark fingers did she kneel. She pressed both palms flat to the raw earth and leaned close, so close her lips almost touched the soil. "I'm still here, baby. Mama ain't going nowhere." The wind moved through the willow, and the leaves made their soft weeping sound. Nothing answered her. Nothing needed to. Night came slow that day, as if the sky itself was reluctant. Delphine walked home alone. The cabin was already too big, the corners already too quiet. She lit the lamp, though there was still light outside, because darkness inside the house felt worse than darkness outside it. She sat in the rocker by the cooled hearth and waited for the long night to finish what the day had started. At some point she must have slept, because she woke with her neck stiff and the lamp burned low, guttering in its chimney. The room was full of blue, not lamplight, not moonlight, but the exact shade of Silas's eyes when the fever first took him. It moved across the walls like spilled milk, slow and deliberate. Delphine did not move. She sat very still and watched the glow gather itself in the corner where his pallet used to be. It thickened, took shape, became small shoulders, a head tipped forward, bare feet that did not quite touch the floor. The shape regarded her without eyes. Then it spoke with her son's voice, thin as a moth wing brushing glass. "Mama, it's cold down there.
"Mama, the door won't stay shut." Delphine reached out one shaking hand into the blue dark. "Silas?" The glow brightened just for a heartbeat, like a smile she could not see. Then the lamp went out all at once, and the cabin plunged into ordinary night. But the rocker kept moving long after her feet had stopped pushing it. Chapter 2. Complete. 912 words. Somewhere past midnight, the dogs began to howl all at once, a ragged chorus that rose and fell like something trying to remember how to speak. Delphine stood on the porch with her shawl clutched tight and stared toward the river road. The moon hung low and mean, the color of a bruised peach. And far off down the dusty track, something small moved against the silver dark. The first night after the burying, the earth over Silas Blue was still raw and naked, no grass brave enough to grow there yet. The willow kept its counsel, branches trailing across the mound like a woman running her fingers through a lover's hair long after he's gone cold. Nothing moved in the graveyard except the fireflies drifting low, slow, drunk on the smell of fresh-turned dirt and something sweeter underneath. Cooter Hayes was the first living soul to come close after dark, and he came stumbling, half a jug of blockade lightning sloshing in his fist. He'd been down at the juke joint past the bend, losing what little money he had to men who cheated cleaner than they prayed. The path home cut right through the colored burial ground because it was shorter, and Cooter had never been afraid of Hates. He figured the dead had better things to do than pother a drunk old man who couldn't even keep his own roof patched. He was singing when he passed the willow, some filthy ditty he'd learned in the war, voice cracked and sour. The song died in his throat the way a candle dies when you shut the door on it. The grave was open. Not dug up, no scattered dirt, no claw marks of a shovel, just open, the way you leave a Bible on the pulpit after service. The pine box sat inside the hole exactly where it had been lain, lid still nailed tight, quilt still net around the corners, but the earth had pulled back from the sides like curtains, leaving a perfect rectangle of nothing between the boy and the stars. Cooter dropped his jug. It shattered against a headstone, and the corn liquor ran down the marble like tears on a cheek that no longer felt them. Cooter took one step backward, then another, until the heel of his brogan caught on a root, and he went down hard in the dust. That was when he saw the footprints, small, bare, coming up out of the grave and walking across the soft dirt, each print filling slowly with groundwater that glowed the faintest blue, like someone had spilled starlight and it was trying to find its way home. The prints led straight through the graveyard, past the older mounds and tilting stones, out toward the gate that hung crooked on its leather hinges. Cooter scrambled up and ran. He ran until his chest burned worse than the liquor ever had, until he burst into the quarters, yelling loud enough to wake every soul who'd been pretending to sleep. Doors cracked open, lamps flared, children whimpered behind their mama's skirts. "Boy done rose," he gasped, clutching at Big Ruth's doorframe. "Silas Blue done climbed out his grave and walked off like he got somewhere better to be." They didn't believe him until they saw the wet shining on his boots, red clay mixed with something that glowed faintly when the lamplight hit it. Then Aunt Violet stepped out onto her porch with her pipe clenched between her teeth and looked toward the willow tree a quarter-mile off. Even from that distance, in the thin moonlight, they could all see it, the dark scar in the earth where a grave had forgotten its purpose. Somebody started praying in earnest. Somebody else started loading a shotgun they hadn't touched since Reconstruction. Delphine came last, moving slow, barefoot in her shift, eyes so wide the whites caught the lamplight like polished bone. She did not speak. She just walked past them all, past the dogs whining and snapping at their chains, past the men clutching axes they suddenly weren't sure how to use. She walked the same path Cooter had run, until she stood at the edge of the open grave and looked down at the box that still held what was left of her child. The quilt was smooth, the nails still in place. Nothing had been disturbed except the earth itself, which had simply stepped aside and let something through. Delphine knelt. She reached down into the hole and pressed her palm to the pine lid, the way you test a skillet to see if it's hot enough for cornbread. Then she stood, slow as a woman rising from prayer, and followed.
3 nights after the grave opened its mouth and politely spat the boy back out, the dogs stopped barking altogether. Not one cur, not one hound, not even the mean little feist that belonged to Jebediah Pike and would snap at its own shadow. Every chain went slack, every throat closed. The silence that settled over Black Oak Bend was worse than screaming. It was the silence of animals that have seen what comes after death and decided noise won't help. Cooter Hayes was the first to vanish, as was proper. He had been the first to see. They found his cabin door standing wide, quilt still warm where his body had lain, pipe still smoldering in the hearth like he'd only stepped out to piss and meant to come right back. His boots waited on the river road, laces knotted in a perfect bow, soles pointed toward home, as if whatever took him wanted him to find his way back if he ever changed his mind. Folks started calling it the taking, the way you name a storm you hope never learns your Christian name. On the 4th night, Delphine's cabin began to breathe. Those close enough to see and brave or foolish enough to look swore the walls swelled outward on the inhale and sank back on the exhale, slow and patient the way a lung does when it's dreaming. The blue glow no longer leaked from the cracks. It lived inside now, steady as lamplight, bright enough that you could read the fear on your own face if you stood across the yard and stared too long. Inside, Delphine moved through her days like a woman under water. She cooked, she swept, she sang the old cradle songs under her breath while the rocker moved by itself in the corner. She set 2 plates at the table every evening, one for her and one for the empty air that sometimes bent the chair when it sat. She spoke to the empty air, too, soft and steady, the way you speak to a child who's had nightmares. Yes, baby, Mama sees you. Yes, baby, I left the milk on the porch. No, baby, don't go far. The night out there still got teeth. No one had seen Silas since the grave gave him up, not with eyes you could trust anyway, but everyone felt him. Children woke crying from dreams of cold hands stroking their cheeks. Old women found their doors unlatched in the morning, though they'd barred them twice. Big Ruth swore she heard barefoot steps on her roof at midnight, light as rain, circling the chimney 3 times before moving on. And every morning another bowl of milk on Delphine's porch steps stood empty, the clay still warm where a mouth had pressed, loved back to stay. White folks heard the rumors, of course, they always do. Jebediah Pike rode down from the big house with 2 of his men, gray shooks crossed their saddles, gray coat flapping like a broken wing. He stood in Delphine's yard at noon, voice loud enough to carry to every cabin in the quarters. "Witchcraft and nigger lies," he shouted at the closed door. "Open up, woman, or we'll burn it down with you in it and dig up whatever devil you got hiding." The door opened before he finished the sentence. Delphine stood there in her clean apron, hair wrapped neat, hands folded calm in front of her like she was greeting Sunday company.
Behind her, the cabin glowed soft winter blue, bright enough that Pike's shadow stretched all the way across the yard and touched his horse's hooves. "Mr. Pike," she said, polite as poison, "my child is sleeping. You'll have to come back another time." Pike's mouth worked, but no sound came out. His horse took one look at whatever stood behind Delphine in the doorway and reared, screaming like a woman. The other two mounts bolted, too, scattering down the road with empty stirrups flapping. Pike hit the dirt hard, hat rolling into the dust. When he scrambled up, the door was already closed again. The bar slid home with the sound like a judge's gavel. He never came back to the quarters after that. Some say he still wakes at night, reaching for a throat that isn't there. That same evening, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise and refused to darken any further. The sun hung low and bleeding behind the pines, too stubborn to set, too weak to rise again. Folks said later it was waiting to see what would walk before it gave up the day. Old Miss Lottie, who was 90 if she was a day and blind in one eye, sat on her porch shelling purple hull peas into a tin basin. She felt the shift first. The air thickened like sorghum boiling, and every pea in her hand went cold as creek stones. She lifted her ruined face toward the road and began to speak in the voice she'd used when she still walked the middle passage in her dreams. "He comin' now, shoes off, heart loud, smell like river bottom and first frost. Lord, have mercy on the ones still breathing." Down the dusty track he came. Silas Blue, barefoot in his burial shirt, walking slow the way children do when they're trying not to wake the house. The shirt hung loose on him now, sleeves past his fingertips, hem dragging 2 perfect furrows in the dust. Moonlight fell straight through him in places. You could see the dark shape of the sweet gum tree behind him right through his chest, yet the dust still took his weight. Every step left a print that steamed faintly and glowed that impossible winter blue. He passed the cabins without looking left or right. Doors stayed shut, lamps were blown out, though it was barely dusk. Not a child cried, not a dog breathed. Only Aunt Violette stood in her yard with her arms crossed, pipe glowing like a coal in her teeth. She watched him come and did not step aside. "Evenin', Silas," she said when he was close enough to hear. The boy stopped, his head tilted the way a bird tilts when it hears something under the leaves. The glow in his eyes brightened until the yard filled with cold blue daylight. "Ain't just Silas no more, is you?" Violet asked softly. The thing wearing Silas opened its mouth. What came out was his voice, layered over something much older, something that had learned words from the wind scraping across graves for 100 years. Part of him still riding Aunt Sister, part of him still love his mama, that part strong enough to keep the rest polite, until now. Violet nodded once, slow. Tell whatever else in their politeness got limits, some doors best left nailed shut. The boy smiled. It was Silas's smile, small and crooked and sweet enough to break a heart that hadn't already shattered. Then the glow dimmed, and for one heartbeat he looked only like a tired child far from home. "Tell Mama I brung her something," he whispered in his own voice alone. He reached into the pocket of the burial shirt and drew out a single blue jay feather, wet and shining. He laid it gentle on Violet's porch rail like a calling card. Then he walked on, past her cabin, past the last crooked fence post, toward the river road where the night finally decided to fall. Behind him, every dog in Black Oak Bend tucked its tail and whined once low and heartbroken, the sound a body makes when it remembers it was ever alive. And in Delphine's cabin, the front door unbarred itself with a soft, welcoming click. The next morning, the blue jay feather was gone from Violet's rail. In its place lay a perfect circle of frost, white and delicate like lace, though the temperature had never dropped below 80 degrees. And for the first time since the burying, Delphine Blue was seen outside in daylight, hanging wash on the line, humming low, with the faintest smile touching the corners of her mouth like a secret she had decided to keep a little longer. Something had come home. Something was being loved back to stay. Morning after the boy walked, the quarters woke to a strange cleanliness. Every porch was swept bare, not a chicken feather nor a speck of dust left behind. Tin buckets that had sat empty since the well pump broke were brimming with water so cold it hurt the teeth. The communal washpot, big enough to bathe a mule in, sat full and steaming, though no fire had been laid beneath it since Friday. Even the outhouse seats were wiped down with lye soap, the stink chased off by a scent like riverstone after rain. Delphine moved among them like a woman half in dream. She carried a willow basket on her hip, handing out still warm hoe cakes wrapped in damp cheesecloth, speaking soft to every soul who dared meet her eyes. "Eat now, he wants y'all strong." Nobody asked who he was. They took the bread with trembling fingers and ate it standing in their doorways, because sitting felt too much.
By the 7th night, the air itself had changed. It tasted metallic, like the moment before lightning, even when the sky stayed clear and star-drunk. Folks woke with their sheets soaked in sweat that smelled faintly of river mud. Children began sleepwalking toward the slough, barefoot and smiling, until their mammas caught them at the edge of the yard and dragged them back screaming. Every mirror in the quarters fogged over at the exact same hour, 3 in the morning, no matter if the night was dry as bone. When the fog cleared, small handprints glowed on the glass, palm and 5 fingers perfect, but colder than any living child's hand had a right to be. Delphine alone moved untouched. Her skin had taken on the same faint luminescence that lived in Silas's eyes, a soft winter blue that brightened when she smiled and dimmed when she thought no one was watching. She no longer slept in her bed. The quilt stayed smooth and untouched. Instead, she sat in the rocker all night, rocking slow, humming the lullaby she used to sing when he had fever dreams. Sometimes the rocker moved with her. Sometimes it moved alone. And sometimes, just before dawn, those who kept vigil saw 2 shadows on the wall, one tall and woman-shaped, one small and boy-shaped, overlapping until you couldn't tell where mother ended and son began. On the 8th day, the sheriff finally came, 3 white men on lathered horses, badges catching the sun like accusations. They rode straight to Delphine's cabin and dismounted with rifles already cocked. The leader, a thick-necked man named Carver, who had hanged 2 black men before breakfast back in '73, kicked the door wide and stepped inside, shouting for the witch woman to come out with her demon child. The cabin was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No bed, no table, no rocker, no quilt. Only bare walls and the clean-swept floorboards glowing faintly blue. In the exact center of the room lay a single bowl of milk, still warm, with one perfect circle of ripples moving outward as though a mouth had only just lifted away. Carver cursed and turned to leave, but the door had already closed behind him. The bar slid home with the same soft, welcoming click the quarters had come to dread. The other 2 deputies pounded and shouted until their fists bled. Inside, nothing answered. Outside, the horses screamed and tore loose from their reins, galloping back toward town with eyes rolling white. When the door finally opened again at sundown, the sheriff's men were gone. Their rifles stood neatly in a row against the porch rail, barrels plugged solid with red clay.
Their badges were pinned to the front door in a perfect smiling face, and Delphine stood on the threshold holding Silas's hand. He was solid now, no moonlight showing through him, no more flickering. His burial shirt had been washed and mended, the Easter collar turned just the way he liked it. His feet were still bare, but the soles were clean. His eyes burned that impossible winter blue, bright enough to read a soul by, and when he smiled, every person watching felt their hearts stop and start again in the same breath. Delphine looked out at the quarters gathered silent in the yard and spoke in a voice that carried all the way to the river. "My baby came home," she said simply. "He was cold, and he was hungry, and he was scared. I warmed him, I fed him, I loved him, and now he's staying." Behind her, the cabin had filled itself again, bed made, table set, rocker moving gentle in the corner. 2 plates waited, steam rising from greens and cornbread, and a slice of ham thick enough to make a preacher lie. Silas stepped forward. He did not walk through the light. He carried it with him. When he passed Aunt Violet, he paused and laid something small in her outstretched hand without being asked. It was the asafoetida bag she had given Delphine the night he died, still warm from his pocket. "Thank you for trying to keep me out, Aunt Sister," he said, voice layered sweet and terrible. "I brought it back, didn't need it no more." Then he walked on, leading his mother by the hand, and every door in the quarters opened by itself as they passed, every lamp flared brighter, every bowl of milk left out the night before refilled itself to the brim, and for one heartbeat every person watching loved him so hard it hurt. Then the sun touched the horizon, and the spell broke like a soap bubble. Fear rushed back in cold and sudden, tasting of iron and grave dirt, because whatever walked beside Delphine now was wearing her child's face better than he ever had in life, and it was still hungry. That night the moon rose red, full and low, looking like a blood clot pressed against black silk. Somewhere out by the slough, something began to sing in Silas's voice, high, sweet, and lonesome, calling every child in Black Oak Bend by their secret heart name, and one by one, small, bare feet began moving toward the water. He came home at true dark, when the red moon had climbed high enough to look down on its own reflection in the slough and decide it liked what it saw. The cabin door opened before Delphine reached the porch, and there he stood, small, barefoot, burial shirt glowing like it had been cut from moonlight itself. His smile he gave her was the same one he wore the day he caught his first catfish, proud and shy, and a little surprised the world had let him win. Delphine dropped the basket of greens she'd been pretending to gather and ran. She fell to her knees right there in the dirt and pulled him against her so hard his bones should have creaked, but they didn't. They felt solid and cool, like river stone that has lain in deep shade all day. He smelled of turned earth and the cold place between stars, but underneath it, so faint only a mother would know, was still the warm coconut oil scent of his scalp after Sunday combing. "Mama," he said into her neck, voice muffled and perfect, "I got so lost." She carried him inside. He weighed nothing and everything at once. When she set him on the pallet, the quilt folded back like welcoming arms. She lit the lamp, though there was no need. The glow coming off him painted the room in winter dusk. She touched his face, his hair, the small half-moon scar on his knee from when he fell chasing lightning bugs. Every inch was there. Every inch was flawless. Every inch was wrong. Because when he stepped past the lamp, he cast 2 shadows on the wall. One was the shadow of a 12-year-old boy, barefoot, thin-shouldered. The other was taller, stretched, with joints that bent the wrong way, and fingers too long for any human hand. It moved a heartbeat after the first shadow, like an echo that had learned to walk. Delphine saw it and felt her heart try to stop. She forced it to keep beating. She had bargained with God and the devil both the night he died. She would not flinch now that one of them had answered. "Are you hungry, baby?" she asked. His eyes brightened till the room grew colder. "Starving," he said, and the tall shadow on the wall licked its lips. She fed him. Lord, how she fed him! Cornbread thick with bacon grease, ham hock falling off the bone, snap beans cooked with salt pork until they sang in the mouth. He ate slow and neat, the way she had taught him, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand after every bite. The tall shadow ate nothing, but it grew darker with every mouthful Silas took until the lamp began to gutter. When the plate was clean, he leaned back against the wall and sighed the way he used to after Sunday dinner, full and happy and ready for a nap. The tall shadow leaned with him, stretching until its head brushed the ceiling, though the boy himself was barely 4 feet tall. "Tell me what it was like," Delphine whispered. She was rocking again, though she had not sat down. "Dark," he said softly, "but not empty. Something was waiting. It knew my name before I did. It said it could come back if I let it ride along. Said it was lonely, Mama. Been lonely since the first slave ship ever touched these shores." The tall shadow rippled, pleased. Delphine reached out and tucked a curl behind her ear. Her hand did not shake. "And you let it?" she asked. "He missed you." And the simplicity of it broke her all over again. "Missed the sound your heart makes when I think I'm asleep. Missed the way you smell when you've been crying and pretending you ain't. Missed the sound your heart makes when I think I'm asleep. I would have let anything ride me if it meant coming home to that." Outside, the night pressed against the windows like a living thing. Somewhere, a child began to cry in its sleep, and then suddenly stopped, as though a cold hand had been laid over its mouth. Silas stood up. The tall shadow stood with him, reaching the ceiling now, fingers scraping the rafters, though the boy himself was barely 4 feet tall. "I gotta go walk now, Mama," he said. "It gets restless if I stay still too long, but I'll be back before dawn. I always come back to you." He kissed her cheek, lips cold, breath sweet as turned earth after rain, and walked out the door without opening it. The tall shadow followed, flowing across the wall like spilled ink, smiling with too many teeth.